Today we're going to be making my take on Azusa's Valentine's Day chocolate cake from K-On! This will feature 2 layers of rich, flourless chocolate cake with a layer of dark chocolate mousse in between, all enrobed in a beautifully glossy chocolate mirror glaze. To start things off, we're going to need some dark chocolate. Use whatever brand you'd like and can afford for this recipe, but I'd recommend using something with around 70% cocoa for that rich chocolate flavour. Simply cut up 340 grams of chocolate into small pieces before placing it into a large heat-proof bowl and setting it off to one side. Moving over to the stove, in a small saucepan we're combining 70 grams of white sugar, 70 grams of brown sugar, 100 ml of water, 1 teaspoon or 5 grams of instant coffee, and a quarter teaspoon or 1 gram of salt. Turn the stove onto a medium heat and then stir everything in the saucepan together until the sugars, coffee and salt have completely dissolved. Next we're adding in 150 grams of cubed unsalted butter very gently into the saucepan so that we don't splash and burn ourselves with the hot sugar syrup below. With the butter now added, we're going to continue to stir this mixture together until the butter has fully dissolved, and then we can remove this from the heat. Pour your hot sugar mixture over your chopped chocolate from earlier and then allow this to sit for 5 minutes. While that's happening, we can quickly prepare some eggs for our cake. In a small bowl or jug, we're cracking in 4 large eggs and adding in 1 teaspoon or 5 ml of vanilla extract. Now we're just going to grab a whisk from our drawer and... excuse me for a second. One trip to the off-screen world later and we've returned with whisk in hand, and now we're simply going to whisk the eggs and vanilla together until everything is well beaten and all the eggs have become one homogeneous golden colour without any weird little bits of egg white floating around. After that, set it off to one side while we move back to our chocolate. Now that the chocolate and the sugar mixture has had some time to get acquainted, we're going to bring them all together by thoroughly mixing the contents of the bowl with a spatula, and you'll see that the mixture will change from a slightly watery looking mess into something like this, a silky and glossy chocolate ganache. To our bowl of now cool chocolatey goodness, we're going to pour in the beaten eggs that we prepared earlier and stir everything together until it's well combined and you're now left with a slightly thickened chocolate custard. Pour this into a sheet pan that has been greased and lined with some baking paper and take a moment to admire just how shiny and smooth this mixture is. Spread the mixture evenly across the pan with your spatula and then give it a few solid taps against the counter to remove any pesky air pockets. Now let's get ready to bake this thing. I've lined a large roasting tray with a clean tea towel, and now we're going to gently nestle our cake tin into that roasting tray. After that, we're going to very carefully add hot water to our roasting tray, making sure not to get any water into the cake, and we're going to fill this up with water until it reaches halfway up our cake tin. If you're using a metal roasting tray like me, be careful not to burn your hands on the metal that has been heated by the almost boiling water that you just added in, and now we're going to very carefully transfer this into an oven that has been preheated to 150 degrees Celsius fan forced and allow our cake to bake for 30 to 35 minutes. After 35 minutes, our cake has now come out of the oven and it should basically look like a huge shiny brownie. Carefully remove the hot baking tin from the roasting tray and then allow the cake to cool at room temperature on a wire rack for about 30 minutes. After allowing the cake to cool on the wire rack for about 30 minutes, we're transferring the cake into the fridge until it's set and completely cool to the touch, which will take around 2 hours. During that time, we can focus on making our mousse. To begin our mousse, we're going to combine 1 tablespoon or 30 ml of water with 1 teaspoon or 5 grams of powdered gelatin. Stir these two together before setting it off to one side and allowing the gelatin to bloom for 5 minutes. While that's happening, we're going to head over to the stove and place a small saucepan over a medium flame. To the saucepan, we're then adding in 120 ml of cream and bringing that to a simmer. When the cream is up to temp, we're removing it from the heat, and off screen I'm stirring in the bloom gelatin. I definitely didn't forget to film this. Not at all. In a bowl, I've pre-chopped 170 grams of dark chocolate, and now we're pouring over our hot cream that has been combined with the bloom gelatin. Let that sit for 5 minutes so that the cream can soften the chocolate, and then using a spatula we're going to mix these two together until they learn to love each other and you're left with a luscious chocolate ganache. Set this off to one side while we make our whipped cream. Give your bowl a quick twirl, and then to that bowl we're adding in 240 ml of cream and 1 teaspoon or 5 ml of vanilla extract. Now we're going to whisk these two together for 1 to 2 minutes over a medium speed or until the cream reaches soft peaks. This means that when we take the whisk out of the cream, it should be able to keep its general shape, but it won't be completely rigid towards the tip. Now we can bring our mousse together. Start by adding in 1/3 of the whipped cream into the chocolate ganache and begin folding the two together. You can be a bit rougher with this first addition as we're mainly loosening up the ganache with this first lot of cream. Once everything is well combined and no streaks remain, we can add in the last 2/3 of the cream and very gently fold everything together. This time we're really trying to preserve the air in the mousse, so take your time and use large sweeping folds to get around and underneath the mousse to bring everything together gently. Once the mousse is one solid colour again, we can set this off to one side until we're ready to assemble our cake. After 2 hours, the flourless chocolate cake has come out of the fridge and we can now remove it from the tin. I'm going to start by cutting along the edges of the pan to release the cake before pulling it out using my overhanging baking paper as handles. Next, I'm going to peel the sides of the paper away from the cake to give you guys a better view and accidentally tear part of the paper because I'm clearly super buff. Next, I'm using a ruler to measure out my cake before trimming it down to size so that it'll fit my loaf tin. The pan I ended up baking the cake in was a little bit too short, so I've cut a couple of smaller pieces that can be used to fill in the gaps. I was kind of making this up on the fly, but I have left proper measurements in the recipe for you guys, which you can check out in the video description below. With the cake now trimmed, set it to one side while we line our loaf tin. I'm going to lightly coat my cake tin with some oil before lining it with some baking paper, leaving some overhang to act as handles for easy extraction. I've also cut 2 pieces of baking paper to fit on the ends of the loaf tin to further help with making this cake easily removable. And now that our cake tin is lined, we can get to assembling. Into our now lined and oiled cake tin, we're adding in one of our larger pieces of cake along with a piece of the filler so that the base of the tin is completely covered. Next, we're pouring over enough of our chocolate mousse so that it matches the thickness of our cake layer. Spread the mousse evenly across the surface of the cake and make sure to push into and down the corners of the tin to avoid creating any air pockets. Now we're topping this with the second layer of cake, and in my case, because if I had to fill in some gaps, I've also ensured that the 2 larger pieces of cake are above each other and the 2 filler pieces are also above each other. Now that everything is nestled nicely into the tin, we're going to place this into the fridge until the mousse is completely set, which will take about 1 hour. And while that's setting up in the fridge, we can focus on making our chocolate mirror glaze. To start our mirror glaze, we're soaking 9 grams or roughly 5 sheets of gelatin leaves in a bowl of water. Make sure that they're completely submerged and then leave them to one side while we focus on everything else. Into a small saucepan, we're combining 90 ml of water and 100 ml of cream. Mix these 2 together and then turn the heat on to medium and bring this mixture up to a boil. Once the wet ingredients are boiling, we're adding in a combined 60 grams of cocoa powder and 150 grams of white sugar that have been whisked together in a bowl. Stir all of this together until the sugar and cocoa powder have dissolved into the liquid, and then we're going to let the glaze come back up to a boil before turning off the heat, and then we're going to squeeze out all of the excess water from the gelatin leaves before adding that into the pan and stirring them into the glaze to dissolve. Once the gelatin has been added in, you should see and feel the glaze get noticeably thicker. With the gelatin now dissolved into the glaze, we need to strain it. As you can see here, I'm holding my sieve and measuring jug in a very awkward position as I'm straining the glaze. But what I'm trying to do is minimize the amount of distance from when the glaze is being sieved to when it hits the jug. By doing this, we're reducing the chances of the glaze forming any air bubbles, which will get in the way of us achieving that perfectly smooth mirror finish. Once this has been strained, we're going to give it a few solid taps to help remove any air bubbles, and then we're going to allow this to cool down to 32 degrees Celsius, which is the ideal pouring temperature for mirror glaze. Every 10 to 15 minutes, come back to the glaze and give it a good stir to ensure it's cooling evenly, and check the temperature with a thermometer. Once it reaches about 40 degrees Celsius, you want to start getting your cake ready for glazing. 1 hour later, the mousse is completely set between the cake layers, and now I'm inverting the whole cake onto a board that has been lined with plastic wrap. Gently and slowly lift off the tin to make sure nothing is stuck, and then remove the baking paper to reveal a beautiful chocolate cake. Using a hot knife, I'm now going to trim the sides of the cake to tidy up the edges, and in my case, I'm also cutting off those filler pieces on the end of the cake. After trimming all 4 sides of the cake, I'm going to use an offset spatula that has been heated in some hot water to smooth out the edges. This is going to help to prevent the glaze from catching on any stray bits of cake, which would lead to an uneven finish. When you finish tidying up the edges, we can finally move on to glazing. I've set up a wire rack with a baking tray underneath to catch all of our glaze, and I've also placed a little mold onto the rack to act as a pedestal for our cake. Using a couple of offset spatulas, I'm going to very carefully transfer the cake onto the mold, and then in a moment that was way too close for comfort, almost drop the whole thing in the process. Once the cake is sitting nicely on its pedestal, it's time for the moment of truth. Our glaze has now cooled down to 32 degrees Celsius, and now we're going to do the most satisfying thing in the world and cover our cake with this incredibly shiny mirror glaze. Once the cake has had the glaze applied to it, we're going to use a small offset spatula to smooth out any blemishes on the top and push the excess glaze down the sides. Let this sit for about 5 to 10 minutes so that the glaze can set, and during that time we can just stand there and marvel at how reflective and shiny this turned out. Then once the glaze is set, we're just using a hot knife or spatula to clean up the drips on the bottom of the cake. Now, because I'm an idiot who can't have nice things, I accidentally dropped some water on the glaze as you can see here, but you can fix that by adding in a tiny bit more glaze and then heating it gently with a blowtorch. Or you could just not drop water on the cake, Andy. With all of this done, we can transfer the cake onto our final serving platter using a couple of offset spatulas, and this, my friends, is the anime kitchen version of Azusa's Valentine's Day chocolate cake from K-On! All that's left to do is use a hot knife to cut ourselves a slice of cake and reveal that beautiful cross section. Now this cake is super rich, so I'm just going to give myself a small piece like so, and then to make this borderline pretentious, I'm going to finish off my slice with a little bit of gold leaf. This of course is totally optional and you definitely don't have to fork out the money to buy some gold leaf, but I've always wanted to try playing with it and I really do like how it turned out. Now it's finally time to reap the benefits from all of our hard work. I'm going to basically take an entire quarter of this slice as my first mouthful, and if you'd be so kind, I'm just going to have a little moment with myself here. It goes without saying that this cake is extremely chocolatey, rich, and decadent. The flourless chocolate cake is dense, thick, and is essentially a baked chocolate truffle more so than a cake. The mousse is creamy, velvety smooth, and much like the cake, it punches you in the face with the flavour of chocolate. Lastly, you have that mirror glaze. In terms of flavour, it's of course chocolatey and sweet, but because it's such a thin layer of glaze, it does get a bit lost amongst the cake and the mousse. That is to be completely expected, as the real purpose of the mirror glaze, apart from sealing cakes in for freshness, is to provide that wow factor in terms of visual appearance, and it definitely delivers in that regard. Overall, this is a wonderfully rich and luxurious dessert, and I believe it's a great way to show your special someone how much you care for them. To quote the wise words of Chef John, if you make this for your date on Valentine's Day, you're guaranteed to get lots of compliments. As always, my friends, thanks so much for watching today's episode. If you enjoyed it, let me know by dropping a like down below, and let me know in the comments what food from anime and other media you'd like to see in the future. Subscribe to the channel for a new episode every single week, and until then, pull up a chair, unfurl that napkin, and I'll see you in the anime kitchen. Cheers.